out, and this only becomes more the case as the site develops. In terms of what the Sea Range buildings were, I'm not sure, but my money is that this is where people lived as the site began to be inhabited more regularly. This site moves from being a place visited occasionally to an occasional place of court, where the king established himself, basing his court in those buildings while political and religious practices occurred across the rest of the site. So yeah, Yeavering. It's an impressive site. Let's catch our breaths again, because I want to talk in a moment about what Yeavering tells us about how we go from scattered farmsteads living off the land to the kinds of kings Bede was talking about. See you in a sec. Believe it or not, what we've just heard is a summary, a rapid run-through of some of what was discovered at Yeavering. A lot has been cut from this episode, but what we do have, I think, gives us enough based on this episode and what we already understand of early medieval England to begin suggesting how kings emerged from the egalitarian world we've argued for previously. Let me summarise very briefly what the buildings were. There were clearly political buildings, places designed for groups to congregate, like the enclosed area, the theatre like building E, and the A range, which I believe to be halls where some people may have slept, but whose primary purpose was for feasts and political meetings. There was also a range of religious buildings designed to support religious activity on the site. This was likely to have a degree of worship, but the only rite which we can be certain of is the large number of burials that occurred at the site, and as I said, we'll turn our attention to the religion at Yeavering in the next episode. So this section here is me trying to tell you what I think went on. Of course, it's a theory, an explanation, one I, of course, think is a good one, perhaps the right one, but some may disagree with me. The big question, I think, is how do we go from simplicity to complexity? Well, to begin with, simplicity was not necessarily the rule. We're talking about farming communities here who originate from a culture where there was social, political, and economic equality. And in many ways, the developments in the 500s are a normalisation of Northern European cultural norms after a century or so of a settlement and adaptation. Also, there were many examples around of more stratified societies in Europe and in Britain. One thing I've really tried to stress in this first half perhaps, of this second series of Old Bones, and something I've sought to argue for since the beginning of Old Bones, is the fundamentally interconnected nature of all human society. We're not prone to isolation. We long as a species for connection, for community, and so long as false barriers like nationalism and religion aren't created, we tend towards connection rather than conflict. This isn't me seeing the present in the past. Instead, the present increase in globalization has made people ask how interconnected humans, quote-unquote, naturally are. This has demonstrated that while our core group may be limited to 150 individuals, our capacity for weak connections or warmth towards others has no limit. This was the case in the 400s and 500s as much as at any time in human history, save for rare moments of what I guess we can call globalism. This was the case in the 400s and 500s as much as at any time in human history. What I'm saying is that certain archaeological phenomena like the overrepresentation of women in early Anglo-Saxon graves, the coastal or riverine position of most early settlements, and the evidence from historical documents that consistently mention the ocean seem to imply that early Anglo-Saxon communities were not disconnected from the continent or from the British with whom they came to share the island. Instead, whether it was the late Iron Age communities in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, or the stratified complex societies in Wales, Cornwall and Pictland, now Scotland, the early Anglo-Saxons knew about kings. They knew about stratified society. And at any rate, there is evidence, such as the reuse of Roman coins, of cultural memories of the empire whose ruins must have filled the environment in which the Saxons came to live. So we have a society that is conscious of the possibility of kingship, of a connected and consciously cohesive unit with a degree of stratification. They might have been egalitarian, but they're aware their fate is not necessary to remain as atomised communities of poor farmers. There may have been positive incentives for some families to begin exerting control over their fellows. They saw others doing it and they may have wanted that. There may also have been negative incentives, such as warfare or a need to bond together due to consistently poor agricultural yields. That might explain a desire for greater socio-cultural cohesion, but it does not explain the how. To do that, I need those of you who've listened to Season 1 to cast your minds back to the episodes on the Neolithic and the long barrows and other monuments such as causewayed enclosures. You might remember, if you can cast your mind back that long, that there is a hypothesis that the extraordinary size of Neolithic and early Bronze Age monuments like Yeavering and Silbury Hill is due to communal activity, that many of the small agrarian or pastoralist groups would come together to work on a shared project that unified these otherwise disparate groups and gave them a sense of unified identity. Indeed, sites like Stonehenge must have existed for millennia as sites for disparate Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic pastoralists, and Bronze Age farmers to come together and create a connection to each other. It was a central focus, an axis mundi as I called it in an essay during my bachelor's, a centre of the world which provided a structure to the year, a time for people to marry, for knowledge to be shared, and fundamentally, for everyone to have good fun and lay the foundations for a peaceful world. I also believe that the Marxist series of revolutions proposed by men like Gordon Childe have massive assumptions at the heart of them, and that human history is far more Burkean, or like Rousseau would argue, but this isn't a politics podcast, so what do I mean? I think things have developed, emerged, rather than being removed and replaced. This is not evolution, not the survival of the fittest. Instead, it's a constant process of trying to stay the same, even as the world changes, as discoveries are made, as things are either improved by the discovery of metal or the wheel, or made worse by the development of stratified societies and monocultural agriculture. That is, there is more similarity between the Neolithic and the Iron Age than there are differences. The differences are skin deep, the cultural dynamics are relatives, and this means the Iron Age communities in Northern Europe continued the practices that have been developing for thousands of years, and the Anglo-Saxons, scions of this complex, long-standing cultural milieu, continued these practices in Britain. This last year of studying has convinced me that most developments in human history are accidental, emotional, and emergent rather than rational or revolutionary. This is not the same as disliking or denying rationality, but that's another more political show. What I'm saying is that I think Yeavering, with its vast enclosure in the shadow of an Iron Age hill fort, was a communal centre, a focus for early Anglo-Saxon communities to come together, to share knowledge, to fall in love, and to create shared positive memories. Because of its humanity, such an important site eventually became the place for important religious ceremonies to occur, and for political decisions to be made on behalf of the meta-group, the collective of small agricultural communities. We won't talk about the religion that occurred there, as we want to dive into that specifically next episode. But what I want to talk about more are the political developments, specifically that theatre-looking building we call Building E. You see, I find it fascinating that Building E is the first building to be built after the enclosure. It speaks to a degree of structure and control emerging over the meetings that were already occurring, and it suggests that someone or some group were beginning to direct and manage these meetings. And from this, I think my theory, the model, becomes quite logical and easy to see. Large organic meetings begin to be structured, and from that structure elites emerge, who turn important cultural events that developed a shared identity into events to increase their power and position at the centre of that shared identity. Okay, so that's the model. How would that work in the early Anglo-Saxon era? Here's what I think may have happened. The basic unit of early Anglo-Saxon society was not the village, but the family. Very often villages were essentially one large family, but most settlements, like at Mucking Essex, were made up of a small number of interrelated but separate families. Life then was fundamentally about cooperation between families, but of course one wanted to provide as much for their family as possible, and there was a degree of probably quite gentle family rivalry. By gentle I mean this is not Hobbesian nightmare of families killing each other to climb one small rung up the social ladder. Instead, families built slightly larger halls or held slightly wealthier funerals. What we don't have is a socialist equilibrium, nor, since we mentioned socialism, anything that's sort of the stages that Marx was banging on about. This is not a slave society, although slavery was rare rather than totally absent, and nor was it a feudal society, though of course this is what this particular future holds for these early agricultural communities. What we have is communalism. Families working together to help each other, but also aware of their differences and keen to at least keep up with the Joneses, or I guess the Wolferas. And that resulted in the ostentatious display that we see in burials, as well as the subtle differences in the hall size at settlements like Yeavering and Mucking, etc. So we have the degree of inequality required for this model to make sense. Inequality cannot come out of equality. That is an impossible statement. Inequality can only increase from pre-existing inequality. Inequality might not have been great, but it definitely existed. Indeed, rather than putting societies in the ancient past being vertically stratified, i.e. in a class structure, they may have been horizontally stratified or occasionally stratified. That is, if you're going hunting, you put the best hunter in charge, and they are the boss until you return from the hunt to the village where it matters political, the wisest is in charge, or economic, where the best farmers are in charge. It's a situational elite, and indeed, it might have been in those situations that early Anglo-Saxons used to further increase their family's importance. Anglo-Saxon kings, as they emerge, had quite specific concerns, notably law, war, and God. They wanted tax, but they weren't really concerned or aware of any specific economic policy, whether macro or micro, save for a general concern with ensuring coinage was trustworthy. That's not to say economics didn't matter. It really, really did, as we will see when discussing the development of towns. But kings didn't concern themselves with that. Instead, it was highly specific external activities that kings focused on. And it may be that it is from these activities that the early Anglo-Saxon elites began to derive more and more wealth, respect, and power. That is, being respected enough to be tasked with making decisions, i.e. being a judge or protecting the village or society via war, both had the biggest impact on the influence of people within their community. But these communities, as we know, are not separate. They come together regularly at sites like Yeavering. There they sought to make decisions, to prepare for war if that was necessary, and deciding who would be nominated to speak, to make decisions, or to lead in battle. In these moments, the same people who were beginning to establish a position of leadership amongst their home village were the ones who may have been involved with making these decisions. It might have been that the wisest or most respected moved from the enclosure to Building E, where each in turn was given the space to address the others and make a decision. And over time, one person seemed to spend longer and longer on the dais until really he was the only person in charge. This process would only have been exaggerated by communication and engagement with the continent. In Northern Europe were kings of a very warlordy type, and it might have been from that Northern Europe milieu that the value on martial prowess emerged. From England's connections to Western and Southern Europe, which became much more explicit in the late 500s and early 600s, a new model for kingship emerged, which inspired those who had gained positions of respect and authority in the way we've just discussed, and for those who still had greater ambitions, showed them how it might be done. What happened in Gaul, now France, after the Western Roman Empire fell, is a fascinating comparison to what happened in Britain. Gaul was a well-integrated, highly Romanised province of the empire, and one which played a far more active role in the final days of the Western Empire than Britain ever did. All that to say, it was Roman far more deeply and for far longer than Britain ever was so, and when the Franks arrived, they didn't replace the Roman culture as seemed to happen in Britain, but instead they adopted and moulded the Roman culture to fit them, which a few hundred years later gave us the strange nation which is France. What the Franks adopted and began to share, often quite explicitly with the Anglo-Saxons across the English Channel, is a model for kingship which used religion to reinforce the authority established through laws and war. When the gods themselves recognise your kingship, then your status and authority go from being something earned into something magically predetermined, unquestionable, and, importantly, giftable to future generations, rather than being surrendered to the feisty and more talented. This is why Yeavering became an important seat for kingship. It wasn't just a gathering place, but a gathering place with important religious connotations. D2, the temple, and the D range generally are, like Building E, the theatre, established early in Yeavering's Anglo-Saxon usage before the kings arose. Burials and religious festivals were conducted there, probably as part of the wider gatherings for which the other buildings were made. First, in my imagination, the emergent kings we're beginning to see didn't mess too much with religion. They liked to happen as it always had. These politicians didn't want to rock the boat until they were established, and, at any rate, being associated with such venerable beliefs in ancestors was enough. But, over time, these elites may have sponsored the building of new temples or deliberately brought important decisions to meetings at Yeavering which occurred during important religious festivals. They may have indeed staked their political decisions on the positive results from sacrifices or other ceremonies. Over time, religion and politics became entwined, but not enough for the kings. And that, I think, is why Christianity became so alluring. And here, right on the cusp of discussing this final stage, the metamorphosis from warlord to king, that is where we'll leave it for today, because we need to add another very large piece of the puzzle, and this episode is too long already. To summarise, kings did not appear in the early